It's great to be back here. It's been way too long, although after you hear the sermon, maybe you'll decide it hasn't been nearly long enough. As Seeley said, I've been part of the Catholic workers since the late 1970s and have been particularly committed to the workers' vision of hospitality and nonviolence. I think words that are not strangers to you at Spiritus Christi. Seeley told me that the theme for the Lenten sermons is planting flowers, and that my sermon should reflect that in some way. If we're taking that literally, I'm probably the worst person in the world to give a sermon about that. Marianne takes care of all the flower planting in our yard. I'm reserved for pulling up weeds, and even that only under careful supervision. I did, however, once hear Henri Nouwen speak about the difference between fruitfulness and effectiveness. He asserted that as Christians, our responsibility is to sow seeds, never really knowing if those seeds will take root and bloom. That is up to God. In our industrial capitalist society, we rarely think in terms of fruitfulness. Rather, we speak of effectiveness, a mechanical metaphor based on the delusion that we are in control, that we can plot out the likely results of our actions and should strive to achieve those results. But Jesus never called us to be effective. He called us to be fruitful, and that means to be faithful. Got two examples to illustrate this, although I think at Spiritus Christi you've got plenty of examples. In the late 1970s, I worked at a Catholic worker house in Syracuse called Unity Kitchen. We ran both a soup kitchen and a shelter for homeless men where we slept whoever showed up. Occasionally women would show up and we'd find some place for them, but usually men. We were open from 8 at night until 7 in the morning. One of our regular guests was a gruff, I thought he was old at that time, but he was younger than I am now, named Pete. And one morning, Pete complained that his back was hurting. Henry, who was the person who taught me how to be a Catholic worker, told Pete, well, why don't you just stay in today and rest up? Pete did, and that day changed his life. He began helping us out at the kitchen, becoming one of our auxiliary staff, and eventually taking shifts running the night shelter where he had slept. Later, he remarried his wife, and they stayed together until death do us part. No one could say a word against Henry without incurring Pete's wrath. He never did quite grasp the notion of nonviolence. But note that there was no carefully planned rehabilitation program, no therapy, just a moment of kindness, of hospitality, of being treated as a human being. Henry did that kind of thing constantly over 40 years, but that one time it struck a chord and bore fruit, and a person's life was changed. The other example is Franz Jagerstatter, whom you probably know, an Austrian Catholic peasant who refused to be drafted into Hitler's army during World War II because he believed Hitler's war was immoral. He had no support from his church, from his bishop, from his parish priest. After spending time in prison, he was executed, leaving behind a widow and 3 fatherless children. He didn't stop the war. He didn't save any Jews. In fact, his story would have been forgotten had it not been for an American sociologist, Gordon Zahn, who went to Germany to research a book on Catholic bishops' response to Hitler's war, which was not an encouraging book. Zahn talked to folks who had known Franz, including his widow, and in 1964 published his biography, In Solitary Witness. The book was read by a Rand Corporation employee named Daniel Ellsberg, who said it helped to inspire him to release the Pentagon Papers, which in turn helped to turn American public opinion against the Vietnam War. Jägerstätter's courage and commitment did not affect World War II, but it did help bring to a close a war nearly 3 decades later. It was ineffective, but fruitful in ways that could not have been predicted. And in 2007, Jägerstätter was beatified by Pope Benedict XVI, who, ironically, had been a member of a Hitler Youth organization. Okay. It appears that today's readings from the Book of Esther and from the Sermon on the Mount were selected because they focus on a common theme, that your prayers will be answered. The message seems straightforward, and the readings harmonize nicely. Yet as I reflected, the surface harmony dissolved. For Esther prays that God will turn the king's heart, quote, to hatred for our enemy, so that he and those who are in league with him may perish. The Sermon on the Mount commands us to love our enemies and pray for our persecutors. Beneath the harmony lurks a contradiction which lies at the heart of Christianity and which is the key to interpreting our own times, specifically the current war in Ukraine. To unpack this, we need to look at the broader context of our 2 main readings, the Book of Esther and the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm kind of give my own little summary of the Book of Esther. The book is set in the reign of King Xerxes of the Persian Empire, who ruled between 485 and 464 BC. Under the influence of his advisor Haman, the king had issued a decree ordering the destruction of all the Jews in the empire, which stretched from India to Ethiopia. It was scheduled for a specific day, although the book actually gives 2 different days that it was supposed to be scheduled for. The edict began by proclaiming the king's desire for peace. When I came to rule many peoples and to hold sway over the whole world, I determined not to be carried away with the sense of power, but always to deal fairly and with clemency, to provide for my subjects a life of complete tranquility, and by making my government humane and effective as far as the borders, to restore the peace desired by all men. I intentionally did not change this to gender-neutral language. There's really not much gender-neutral about this story. The decree goes on to describe the Jews as a most singular people, which is continually at variance with all men, lives by divergent and alien laws, is inimical to our interests, and commits the worst crimes, so that stability of government cannot be obtained. It then authorizes their destruction without pity or mercy, together with their wives and children. Now Esther, who was Jewish, had recently become queen. After the previous queen, Vashti, had refused a royal order to attend a banquet, the king issued an irrevocable decree that Vashti could no longer come into the presence of the king, in order that, quote, all wives will honor their husbands, from the greatest to the least. Patriarchy must be preserved at all costs. Esther was chosen to replace Vashti after a beauty pageant of sorts. When Esther's foster father, Mordecai, learned about the decree authorizing the destruction of the Jews, he begged Esther to go into the king and plead for her protection. Esther replied that any man or woman who goes to the king in the inner court without being summoned suffers the automatic penalty of death, unless the king extends to him the golden scepter, thus sparing his life. This is the king who talked about how he wanted peace. Thus, Esther would be risking her life if she went into the king unsummoned, and this was the situation which sparked the prayer that was in our reading today. Okay? The king doesn't execute Esther, rather he hears her plea. The royal decree, apparently, however, cannot be rescinded Therefore, he issues another decree giving the Jews the authority to defend themselves against their enemies and giving others the right to aid the Jews in their self-defense. Haman is executed, and on the day set for the extermination of the Jews, it is their enemies who are exterminated. Now, in some ways, this story seems analogous to the brutal war in Ukraine. And indeed, many are calling on us to respond sort of as King Xerxes did to Esther, to send military aid to empower the Ukrainians to defend themselves. So far, so good, and yet we have the Sermon on the Mount, which commands us not only to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, but to love our enemies and to pray for our persecutors, in a phrase, to live nonviolently. And make no mistake, the Pax Romana imposed on Israel was brutal in the extreme. Jesus' nonviolent campaign led to his brutal execution, and a few days later, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Or a few decades later, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So how are we to interpret the scripture today? We are not Estherites, we are Christians. We must apply scripture through the lens of Jesus Christ. It is perhaps here that we must go back to that notion of fruitfulness that I started with, of planting seeds. We are not called to be effective, to make rational action plans that we are sure will work. We are called to be faithful, to be fruitful, which means to be faithful to the gospel. I don't have the answers. I don't have a plan, but I would like to conclude by sharing a few reflections about the situation in Ukraine from a gospel perspective. We must do everything we can while being faithful to gospel nonviolence to help the Ukrainian people, and particularly refugees. But also, if we feel more sympathy, more called to respond to the Ukrainians than we have been to victims of war and violence in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, in the Congo, in Latin America, and I could go on, we must ask ourselves, why is this the case? Is it racism, either conscious or unconscious? Is it the fact that these refugees are fleeing persecution by a traditional enemy, the Russian military, rather than fleeing persecution by the US military or our allies like Saudi Arabia? I think we need to look critically at the role of the United States, at our own guilt in this situation, going back a few decades to when the Soviet Union disintegrated. What would have happened if the US had drastically reduced our military and actively engaged with the newborn Russian democracy instead of continuing to spend more on our military than the entire rest of the world does combined? What if we had taken that theoretical peace dividend? Folks remember talk of the peace dividend way back then? And spent it on the health and education of our own citizens. Would Russia have responded in kind? Would we have a more peaceful world? Would it have remained a democracy? And would we be in the situation we are now, where we're at such risk of a nuclear war which could exterminate the human race in the space of 20 minutes? I am awed by the courage of President Zelensky and of ordinary Ukrainians, especially those who dared to stop Russian armored vehicles with their bodies, weaponless, the epitome of nonviolent resistance. But I can't help asking, what if the Ukrainians had planned for and adopted nonviolent civilian-based defense? What if they hadn't responded with violence and had let the Russian army occupy the country? It seems like the Russians will successfully seize the Ukraine. The real question is, can they hold it? If the Ukrainians had instituted a planned campaign of nonviolent non-cooperation, would the Russians eventually have more trouble controlling the country in the long term? Would fewer people end up being killed on both sides? Political scientist Gene Sharp and others have detailed strategies for this approach, and the Danish resistance to the Nazis during World War II gives us a real-life model of how nonviolent civil resistance can be effective even against Hitler. Ironically, it is in Russia that we are seeing perhaps the greatest eruption of nonviolent action. By one estimate, over 13,000 Russians have been arrested for protesting their country's invasion of the Ukraine. Far more, I think, than the number of Americans arrested protesting the early stages of our wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Central America, Vietnam. So I see in Russia perhaps a great hope for a peace movement. Here in Rochester, we also need a rejuvenated peace movement. The Rochester Pax Christi, founded by Jan Bazilla, has faded in the course of the pandemic. Our major activity for decades, was a monthly Sunday Mass for Peace, originally at the Culver Road Armory, when that institution was a cathedral of militarism. Now I guess it's a cathedral of capitalism. And so we moved on to the Federal Building, but the Masses stopped a couple of years ago. However, a new upstate Pax Christi is being formed and had its first action on Ash Wednesday at the Catholic Cathedral in Syracuse. Our focus is on persuading the Catholic Church to adopt nonviolence and repudiate just war theory. I'd love to have enough Rochester folks join to rejuvenate the monthly Mass at the Federal Building, and if anyone's interested, please talk to me after Mass. I do have a couple of the flyers that we gave out that day, and I have a few copies of the latest St. Joseph's House Catholic Worker newspaper, which I just took over the editorship with. So, well, thank you. Nobody walked out. I'm impressed. The Spiritus Christi hasn't changed all that much. So thank you.